are now live. We're on air. So, welcome. My name is Anne-Marie Bonneau, and I write the blog The Zero Waste Chef, and this is my sourdough starter webinar. So I went plastic-free in 2011, and I don't produce any garbage in my kitchen, with a bit of planning is actually not that difficult. So in my kitchen, I follow 3 simple rules. I don't buy packaged food, I don't buy processed food, and I don't throw anything out. And so basically, I eat real food, and sourdough bread is real bread. Oh, by the way, if anyone wants the class notes after, I'm going to post them on my blog tonight after we're done with this, and the link so you can watch the recording on YouTube. So I'll just talk a tiny bit about the history of sourdough. So it's one of the oldest traditions. Before the introduction of commercial yeast a couple of hundred years ago, all bread was sourdough bread, and people have been baking this way for about 6,000 years. Commercial yeast speeds up production and thus profits, but it's not as nutritious and I don't think as delicious as sourdough bread. So I'll get right to it. So how to make a starter. So I've narrowed it down to, well, actually 3 steps with an optional 4th step. Basically, you combine flour and water. You stir it daily whenever you think of it. Once you see activity, bubbling, then you start feeding the starter. Now the optional step is to name your starter. So mine is named Eleanor, after Eleanor of Aquitaine. I'm obsessed with English history. So after you do that, in about a week, if everything goes well, you'll have a starter that's less than a week. You'll have a starter bubbling, and then you keep feeding it. Maybe after another week, if it's vigorous enough, you can start baking. So it depends on your kitchen. My sister lives in Canada, and her kitchen is cold in the winter, and so fermented food takes longer to bubble in her house. So I'll talk a little bit about the ingredients and equipment. So water, I use filtered water for my fermented food. I just have to be where I live. We have a community room with a water filter, so I go and get my water there. Chlorine will kill the microbes in fermented food. I don't have a problem with chlorine. I've just read about it. If you have a lot of chlorine in your water, you can smell it. And if you do have chlorine, just pour water into a big vessel, into a jug, and just open it up maybe the day before you're going to use it, and the chlorine will dissipate. And that's all you have to do. The flour. Okay, so I buy my flour. This is my staple bulk. So I buy them in glass jars or sometimes cloth bags, although I find the flour because it's fine. It works better in glass jars. So for the starter, I use approximately, don't get too hung up on this, I use half white and half whole wheat, or half white and half rye. I find my starter really likes rye. She gets really perky when I feed her rye. And the container you're going to use, I like to use a glass container. I like wide mouth because it's easier to get the starter out of it and stir it. If you have a tall narrow bottle, or jar, it's just kind of hard to get out. So, but anyway, I like to use glass because then I can see the bubbling and what's going on. Don't use plastic or metal because a sourdough starter is acidic, and that will react with plastic or metal. So use glass or ceramic. And oh, I like to use a kitchen scale. You don't have to use a scale. So I make all sorts of fermented food. I make sauerkraut and dill pickles and sour cream, and kombucha and ginger beer and mead, and the stuff just works. There's no real recipe, but I'm a little uptight about my sourdough, and so a scale results in more accurate measurements. If you measure out 100 grams of flour, and then you put that in a measuring cup, it could go up to almost 3/4 of a cup, or it could be, so it can really vary. So if you're just starting out, like don't rush out and spend a bunch of money on a scale. But if you're going to do any serious baking, scale is a really good idea. I don't like telling people to buy stuff, but I love my scale. Anyway, so it's optional. All right, so step 1. We're going to combine flour and water. So here I've got my container. Gee, you can't see. Got to move the computer down so you can see what I'm up to. There. You can kind of see. All right, so I'm going to tear out my scale, just set it to 0 so I can see. Then I'm going to add warm water. So I heated my water. I drink a lot of tea, and so I'll feed my starter when I'm making tea, because then I'll have some warm water. You don't want it hot though, so let it cool a bit, or add some room temperature water to it. So, all right. Can you see the? Okay, so let's say I added. I don't want to confuse anyone. So I'm going to go by what I have. Say I have 100 grams of water. Now I'm going to add 100 grams of flour, so I'll add some white. I'm going to do rye today, so I'll add half and half of that. Oh, that's a little bit more rye. That's fine though. Starter seems to like rye. Okay. Right. There we go. Now I'm going to stir it up. Okay. Oh, another optional piece of equipment is this rubber sponge. If you've ever made paper mache, you know that flour and water is really sticky. So, okay, there we go. So there's my starter. It's thick, like thick pancake batter. So there it is. And what I'm going to do is every time I stir it up, and then I'm going to put it aside somewhere. Oh, there's somebody else, I think. Oh, somebody just asked a question. Okay, I haven't figured out where those go, those questions. So that must be somebody. Oh, I'll have to answer it. Oh, wait. I'll have to answer the question after. I don't see it. Sorry. I'll answer it after I'm done. What was I saying? Oh yeah. Okay. So I'm going to set it aside. I'm going to put a plate or a cloth, just something to keep bugs and stuff out. I'm going to set that aside, stir it every day, and then, okay, we're going to pretend it's now 5 days later, and I've been stirring every day a bunch of times. And here's my starter. Look, it's starting to bubble. So, now it's time to feed it. All right, so I'm going to take out about 80% of this. And I'm going to set it aside. I keep all of my discard. This is from an earlier feeding. Keep it in another bowl. So stir this down to get rid of the bubbles. And then, can you see what I'm doing? Oh, good, you can't. Okay, this is a no budget video. Okay, so there, I removed about 80% of it. With 100 grams flour, 100 grams water, you'll have about 2 tablespoons left of starter. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to add to this 100 grams of water and 100 grams of fresh flour. So that's my first feeding. Sometimes people get confused around here. Okay, now, I don't want to add, I don't want to confuse anyone. I'm not going to add the water directly to here because it might be too warm. So, I'm going to measure out 100 grams of my warm water. Okay, I added too much there. Make sure, yeah, that's nice. It's warm but not hot. I added a bit too much. Okay, that's good. Now I'm going to add the warm water to the starter. Stir it up. Oh, somebody just came in. I have all right. Okay. All right, stir that up. Add my flour. So add half white or so. And then rye or whole wheat. Whole wheat's much better for you. It has omega-3. White is super processed. So if I did this with all white flour, I'd have really bubbly starter and big voluminous loaves, but it's not as nutritious. So, all right, then I stir that up. Flour all over, and there, and that's it. So I'm going to continue to do that every day. You remove about 80% of the starter, and then I'm going to add fresh flour and water. Do that every day until it's bubbling vigorously. And then at that point, it's ready to use. And that's it. That's all you do. Nobody showed me how to do this, so I remember I was really confused the first time I did it. And then I've got, let's see. So I've got some notes. Okay, you can keep your starter out on the counter, or you can keep it in the fridge. If you keep it in the fridge, you only have to feed it once a week. If you keep it on the counter, you have to feed it every day. And so if you feed it every day, you get a starter that's more sweet. If you keep it in the fridge, you get one that's more vinegary, more sour. But if you keep it in the fridge, your pile won't grow, you know, as much. Feed it every day, you end up with a lot of discard. So, it also depends on how much you bake. So if you bake every day, you're not going to have a ton of discard. I don't have time to bake every day. I wish I did. Some people think you should feed it a couple of times a day before you bake bread. So I only feed mine once a day. I've tried feeding it twice a day, and honestly, I haven't noticed a difference. But I'm not a professional baker, and I say in my blog, I'm not a professional chef, and that's the point. Like, anybody can do this stuff. So, Oh, okay, so some troubleshooting. I haven't had anything like mold grow on my starter. I haven't had any problems. The acidic environment of the starter will kill any bad bacteria that ends up in there. You can get something called hooch forming on top of your starter. So it's like gray water. And that happens if you neglect the starter. So you can just pour that off and feed your starter, and it will come back to life. And so that's kind of alcoholic, that hooch. I read about, I mean, slightly alcoholic. I read about a prisoner who got in trouble because she was making sourdough, and she got hooch on it. I think it was disciplined because it was hooch on the stove. So, oh, last step. Name your starter. So someone on Facebook told me, actually she might be watching, she's going to watch tonight. She said she was having a hard time bringing her starter into the world. It just wouldn't bubble, and I gave her a bunch of ideas, like if your kitchen is cold, find a warm spot, maybe on top of your refrigerator. There's a pilot light on in my oven, and so I'll sometimes put my starters in there. If you have a heating pad, you can turn it on low and put the starter on top of that. I mentioned the water. Check your water if your starter's just not doing anything. Don't panic, though. It might just take a little while. And another thing you can do is name it. So, and then you'll be more vested once you name it. You'll take better care of it. So, all right. So now I want to talk about the sourdough baker's dilemma. So you might be thinking, I'm going to have a pile of starter if I feed it all the time like that. And what do you do with all of it? So we refer to it as discard, but you don't really want to throw it away. And you can make all sorts of things with it. So I bake with mine. I make buttermilk waffles, which are really good. And I use homemade cultured buttermilk for those. And I make a lot of pancakes. And I make these crackers. They're so good. They taste cheesy. They don't have any cheese in them, but because they're tangy. They just have starter, whole wheat flour, olive oil. You can use coconut oil, baking soda, and salt, and that's it. They're really good. You can sprinkle stuff on top, like my daughter likes nutritional yeast. She'll sprinkle that on, or you can sprinkle on flax seeds or whatever. And that's that. And then I've talked about the fridge. Another thing you can do if you have lots of starter is find someone to unload it onto. And I can talk a little bit about the benefits of sourdough quickly. So sourdough bread is fermented, and so that processes the grains properly. So you're supposed to soak grains before you eat them. Fermentation, it pre-digests the grains, and that reduces the amount of gluten in the dough. And I've given my sourdough bread to people who are sourdough intolerant, and they can eat it just fine. So I think a lot of people, not celiac, but some people aren't actually gluten intolerant. They're bad bread intolerant. The bread hasn't been prepared properly. So sourdough has a lower glycemic index, so your insulin doesn't spike like it does when you eat pasty white bread. There are phytates in grains, and these are anti-nutrients. The anti-nutrients bind to minerals, and your body can't absorb those minerals. But when you ferment the grains, the fermentation breaks those bonds, and then your body can absorb the minerals. And not only the minerals, but the minerals in something you eat with the bread. So, like a tomato sandwich. If you eat it with bread that hasn't been fermented, you don't absorb the minerals as well. But I also tell people don't get too neurotic about all of this, because you'll give yourself an ulcer. Sourdough bread, it keeps longer, so I've been baking bread for 20 years, but I've only been making sourdough for I don't know, 3 years. And the when I used commercial yeast, it tasted good, but it was stale the next day. You have to eat it the first day. Sourdough keeps for about a week. It's got this nice hard crust, and it just doesn't go stale. So as quickly. Oh, and it literally makes your mouth water, which prepares your body to digest it. And finally, it's delicious. And I think that's it. I think I covered anything. So, oh, Evie has muted her microphone. Do you have any questions?
I do. So you said you feed it every day. So how many times on average do you feed it before you actually use it?
Okay, that's a good question. Once you get it going, you feed it every day. So feed it every day until it's really bubbly, and then it's ready to use.
I mean, what is your average? Is it an average of maybe 3 days or an average of 5 days? Or is there no average? You just watch it?
It depends on your kitchen. I read one recipe online. It said your starter will be ready to use in 3 weeks. And mine was way faster than that. It was probably a couple of weeks at the latest.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would say, it depends on your kitchen. But I would say a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But then once it's bubbling and ready to go, then to maintain it, you just feed it every day if it's out on the counter, or if you put it in the fridge once a week. So I've just showed you how to get it started.
Okay.
The way you feed it once it's ready to go, once you have a mature starter, to maintain it, you just feed it the way I showed you.
You just feed it once a day. You just keep going like that, and then you just use it whenever you want. Then at that point.
Yep. Yeah. If you leave it out on the counter, you put it in the fridge. Just feed it once a week.
Okay. So do you put yours in the fridge like in between when maybe you won't need to be baking as much, just to kind of slow it down, or that's...
Yeah. So, if we're gonna go away, then I'll put it in the fridge.
Okay, that makes sense. Because if you're not using it, then you don't want to be feeding it every day, I suppose.
Yeah. No. And if you leave it out on the counter, if you leave it at room temperature and you don't feed it, it's gonna get pretty vinegary. The other thing is that starters are pretty resilient. So, even if you do neglect it, not severely, but if you haven't fed it for a couple of days or a few days and you start feeding it again, it'll perk up eventually.
Okay.
I don't think it'll even take that long, but yeah. So books. I didn't mention books. Oh. So the recipe I use is basically Michael Pollan's recipe and cooked.
Okay.
And, yeah. So I love Michael Pollan. This is a signed copy of his book. And yeah, what made me think of the books was your question. Oh. Okay, so Michael Pollan bases his recipe on Tartine, which is Sandor Katz's book, or Chad Robertson. I'm getting my gurus mixed up. Chad Robertson is in San Francisco, and the thing I love about this book is that it has a ton of pictures. So I didn't have these when I started making sourdough, and I didn't know it was supposed to look like this when you fold it. To me, this is the most difficult, and it's not that difficult, but it's the trickiest part, folding it when you shape your loaf. And I didn't have pictures, and so, and the recipes in here. They're so good. I like to make the cardamom raisin bread, or is it coriander raisin bread, which doesn't sound like coriander would go with raisin, but it's good. It's better than cake. I'd rather eat that than cake, and I like cake. So this is a good book. And Sandor Katz is like the, fermentation god. He has a little bit on sourdough in here, not a ton, but if you're interested in other fermented foods, this is a great, I love this book. And finally, This is Good Gut. All these books are related to Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan talks about Sandor Katz and Chad Robertson and Cooked and this couple. So the Sonnenbergs, they run the Sonnenberg lab at Stanford, which is right not far from me, just down the street. So they're pioneers into research on the gut, the microbiota, and they talk about what they eat, and they make sourdough bread. So, and they have some other recipes. I don't know if they have. I don't think they have a recipe for sourdough bread in here, but they have a meal plan, and it's just fascinating. Like all of our health is connected to our gut, and it's not woo-woo. It's not some fad diet. Basically, they eat real food that they cook themselves. So, and your question reminded me of something that I wanted to say and never forgot. So,
how do you store your bread?
How do I score it?
How do you store it?
Oh, store it. Oh, so I thought I said store it. I'm going to pretend you said score it.
Okay, we can talk about scoring too. That's fine.
That's how I score it.
Okay, that's how I score mine too.
It's awesome. It changed my life. My loaves were okay. And then I scored them with the razor blade. At first I was holding it with my thumb and forefinger over a 500-degree pot, and it just didn't work. I thought I was going to slice my fingers off and burn my hand, and then I put it on a stir stick. I love this little tool. Okay, storing. So I sew cloth produce bags out of whatever fabric I have around. So this was actually an old sheet. This isn't bread I made. I bought this at the bakery. My daughter likes it. It's also so it's made with a leaven, so sourdough, but it's not labeled as sourdough. So anyway, so yeah, that's a long answer to your question, but that's what I do, and I'll even store bread in the freezer. And here's the other half of that bread. That's another produce bag. I just I don't even put drawstrings on them because I like everything. I like easy. So that's how I store it.
Okay.
So I don't use any plastic. If I did store them in plastic, I guess they would keep longer in the freezer. But we gobble up bread pretty quickly. It never stays in the freezer for very long. So that's how I store it. So, any other questions?
So, how do you store, like, when you have to take out the 80%? You said you make cookie or crackers and pancakes and waffles, and I mean that seems like. Do you end up with a lot of that? I mean, do you end up throwing that away, or?
Oh, no, we don't throw it away. I don't throw it away. The crackers are addictive. They're really, really good. I don't think I've ever thrown away a single cracker. They freeze really well, and I freeze food in jars. I wrote a blog post about that earlier this year, and I couldn't believe how much people shared it. For me, it was a lot of shares. I had over 10,000 shares on Facebook, and it's my most popular post ever. So I just put them in jars. So I'll do that with the batch I made tonight. I'm looking for a good jar. Okay, this is a gigantic jar. My daughter, I don't know if you can really, it's huge. Look at the size of this jar. The restaurant she works at just recycles them. She's gonna bring them to me. So I just put them in a jar like that and stick it in the freezer. They keep really well, and so actually, when my boyfriend and I first started dating, I'd bring him these crackers. They're so good. They're like a love potion in solid form. So they always last. On my blog, I have the recipe, and I also have a recipe for pancakes, and I really like that recipe because it's so easy. I love the crackers. They're a little bit more work. I make the dough ahead of time, and then I keep it in the fridge, and then when I feel like making them. So I made these tonight right before this started, just in the nick of time. But the pancakes, those are great. So what I'll do with those is I'll feed my starter, and with the discard, I just crack an egg in it. Well, let's say 2 eggs. Crack a couple of eggs. Add some melted, like a tablespoon of melted butter. This is all on my blog. And I melt it in the pan to butter the pan. Pour it in the mixture, and then add about 1/8 of a teaspoon salt, 1/8 of a teaspoon baking soda, and then it gets kind of fizzy, or bubbly, not fizzy. Gets a little bubbly, and then that makes 2 good-sized pancakes. And if you want them a little fluffier, because they can be kind of crepe-like, add a little flour, fresh flour to the starter, like a tablespoon. So that's a really good way to go through a starter. Okay, and another thing you can do is make less starter. So on my blog, I have 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, and like for a lot of people, this is really confusing, and so I don't want to confuse people, but you can use half as much if you want. Use 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water. I once taught a sourdough starter class to my neighbors, and there were about 8 of them, and I was talking away and just doing what I did here and blah, 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 and looking down, and I looked up at all of them, and they were all like this. Like, they were so confused. So, but yeah, I can go over the recap here. So you combine flour and water, stir it daily when you think of it. Once you see it bubbling, feed it. And then feed it every day until it's bubbling a lot. I should have had a picture of a super bubbling starter, but I fed mine during this webinar, so I can't show you. But if you remember, it was when I showed it to you, it was quite bubbly. So it's pretty easy. And if it goes wrong, you've only wasted a little bit of flour and water. And so my starter is, she is 2 years old. And I've heard of people who've had theirs for 20 years. King Arthur Flour sells one that is 300 years old. So you can keep them going for a long time. So, anything else?
I don't know if you can see the questions of the chat, but I'll go ahead and read it to you if you need to. That way somebody can get their question answered.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't know why I can't. I mean, I'm going to Google Hangout, and
yeah, it's like a little chat box, and I actually just saw it. It's behind. It's like in the window behind where my video is, and I just saw it on the corner when I heard that beeping noise.
Yeah, I see the group chat window. And it says that you joined and Evie joined, but I don't see I just hear them. I feel like my mom. Like, oh, can you tell me how to look at the questions?
Well, let me read it to you, and that way you can just answer it while you're here. It's from Olivia and Amy. And she said, is there a way to make the sourdough bread by leaving the dough during the day and not kneading it until you get home from work, or will that not work?
There's awful feedback. I don't know what that is. Could you repeat that again, please?
I can. She said, is there a way to make sourdough bread by leaving the dough during the day and not kneading it until you get home from work, or will that not work?
So I'm trying to do this. I tried to make no-knead sourdough bread last week. I've tried it a couple of times, and it was a mess. It didn't work. So I'm doing something wrong. I'm trying to figure that out. There's a great recipe. Mark Bittman had it in the New York Times, I don't know, 12 years ago for no-knead bread. And so I used that, and instead of regular yeast, I used my sourdough starter. And I've tried it a couple times. I have to figure it out. You can try Googling it, and you'll see a bunch of recipes. Oh, so here's a term you can use if you want to impress people. You can say, my starter is 100% hydration, which just means equal parts water, equal parts flour. So I think maybe I need to use either less starter or one with a different hydration to make that work. So that's on my to blog list. I've got to figure that out because yeah, I made bread on the weekend. So the bread is not difficult to make. Like I like to tell people, it's easy when you know how. Once you've done it, then it's pretty easy, but you have to be home for quite a while. I like to do a cold proof, so that's great. That breaks up the process, and also my proof. So I'll do the bulk fermentation, and then every 45 minutes I have to get up and I turn the dough. It's not kneading, it's just turning it. So the bulk fermentation lasts about 4, maybe 5 hours, depends on your kitchen. So you kind of have to be home. I work from home mostly, so it kind of works out. But I would love to figure out the no-knead bread. So I've seen people do it. I know it can be done. I've had a blogger friend of mine makes it. Meg, she makes it. So I just have to figure that out. Are there any other questions that you can see?
I don't see any more.
Okay. Well, for some reason, I'll see them later. This happened the last time I did this. If there are any other questions, they'll pop up on my YouTube on the link. Anyway, hopefully I can find them. So, all right. Well, anything else?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. It was fun, and good luck. Let me know what you name your starters. Well, thanks for coming.
All right. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Amy.